Northern Minnesota, January 1888. While neighbors fed their iron stoves every 2 hours through sub-zero nights, burning cord after cord just to keep their families above freezing, Finnish bachelor Matti Hivoranen slept soundly beside what they called his stone coffin, 4 tons of river rock packed into a wire cage, with his stovepipe snaking through the mass like a bent snake before rising to the roof. They called it wasteful. They called him a fool. A proper stove needed a straight pipe shooting heat up and out, not winding through a pile of rubble that ate up half his cabin floor. Then January 13th arrived. The children's blizzard swept across the plains and into Minnesota. Temperatures plunging from the 20s to 20 below zero in hours, with 60-mile-per-hour winds driving snow through every crack in standard log construction. Neighbors burned 80 to 100 pounds of wood in a single night, fathers stumbling outside in whiteout conditions to haul more fuel, families huddled around glowing iron that barely kept bedroom corners above freezing. But that morning, when John Peterson pushed open Maddie's door expecting to find a frozen corpse, he found 58-degree air and the smell of yesterday's coffee. The fire had died at midnight. The rocks were still warm to the touch 12 hours later. What did this immigrant bachelor understand about storing heat instead of wasting it up the chimney that every other settler had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We document the methods that kept people alive when accepted wisdom failed. The morning after the children's blizzard passed through northern Minnesota, John Peterson forced his cabin door against a 3-foot drift and stepped into air so cold it burned his lungs. 22 below zero by the mercury thermometer nailed to his porch post, with the wind still gusting hard enough to drive ice crystals like needles against his face. He'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, stumbling outside 4 times during the night to haul armloads of split birch to keep his family's iron stove fed. By dawn, his wife and 2 youngest children were huddled under every quilt they owned, breath fogging in the 35-degree air near their beds. Peterson pulled on his heaviest coat and started the quarter-mile trudge to Matti Hivoranen's place, expecting the worst. The Finnish bachelor lived alone in a cabin smaller than Peterson's, heated by the same kind of cast-iron box stove that barely kept families alive on nights like this. But Matti had built that strange contraption last summer, 4 tons of river rock packed into a wire cage with his stovepipe threading through it like a snake before rising to the roof. Everyone in the valley had laughed at the ugly pile of stones eating up half the man's floor space. Now Peterson figured he'd find the hermit frozen solid beside his foolish experiment. He pushed through the drifts to Matty's door and knocked. No answer. Peterson lifted the latch and stepped inside, bracing for the sight of a corpse. Instead, a wave of 58-degree air hit his face, carrying the smell of yesterday's coffee and the faint scent of warm wood. The small thermometer hanging from a roof beam read 58 degrees. The fire in Matty's iron stove had died hours ago. Cold ashes, no coals, the firebox dark. But the wire cage filled with river stones still radiated heat like a massive oven, the rocks warm to the touch even 12 hours after the last flame had died. Matty sat at his small pine table in his stocking feet, calmly spooning oatmeal from a bowl, while Peterson stood gaping. "Mornin', John," he said in his careful English-Finnish accent still thick after 15 years in America. "Coffee's still warm on the stones if you want some." Peterson walked slowly around the rock cage, holding his hands inches from the wire mesh. Heat rose from the stones in gentle waves, nothing like the fierce blast of an iron stove, but steady and even, warming the air at floor level where people actually lived and slept. The contraption looked even stranger up close, a 4-by-6-foot rectangle of salvaged wagon iron and fence wire, 3 feet high, stuffed with rounded stones the size of bread loaves. Matty's 6-inch stovepipe entered the cage near the bottom, snaked back and forth through the rock mass for nearly 20 feet, then rose straight up through the roof. "How long since you fed the fire?" Peterson asked. "Midnight, maybe a little after," Matty replied. "Burned hot for 3 hours, then let her die down. Rocks hold the heat all night." Peterson thought of his own cabin, where the iron stove had to be fed every 2 hours, or the family woke to ice forming on the inside of the windows. He'd burned through nearly 100 pounds of split wood during the blizzard, and his cabin had never felt as warm at dawn as Maddie's felt right now, with no fire at all. The idea had started 18 months earlier, when Maddie first arrived on his 160-acre claim in the cutover country north of Duluth. Like every new settler, he'd thrown up the quickest, cheapest cabin he could manage before winter. 14 by 18 feet of hand-hewn logs chinked with clay and moss, heated by a small iron stove with a straight pipe shooting up through the roof. That first winter nearly killed him. The stove roared when he fed it, heating the air near the ceiling to 70 or 80 degrees. But by morning, the cabin dropped to barely above freezing. He burned through 8 cords of wood, nearly stripping his small wood lot, and still woke most mornings to frost on the inside walls. But Maddie had grown up different from his American neighbors. In the forests of northern Finland, his family's first building on any new homestead wasn't a house. It was the savusauna, the smoke sauna where heated stones provided hours of warmth after a single firing. His grandfather had built Russian-style masonry heaters, massive constructions of stone and clay, where hot gases from a small fire traveled through internal channels, heating tons of masonry that radiated warmth for 12 to 24 hours. Maddie had seen the principle work through dozens of brutal northern winters: store heat in dense mass, release it slowly, use half the wood for twice the comfort. The problem was materials and time. A proper masonry heater required hundreds of fire bricks, special clay, and weeks of careful construction. Maddie was alone on his claim, with winter coming fast and no money for manufactured materials. But he had a river full of rounded stones, salvaged wire from abandoned fencing, and iron strapping from a wrecked wagon. Through the summer of 1887, he hauled bucket after bucket of stones from the creek bottom, 4 to 8 inch granite and basalt, rounded smooth by decades of spring floods. His neighbors watched him make over 100 trips, 35 to 40 pounds per load, building what looked like a stone coffin in the middle of his tiny cabin. Carl Jensen, who sold stoves and hardware in the nearest settlement, stopped by to inspect the strange construction. "Heat rises," he told Maddie, tapping the conventional straight pipe that shot from stove to roof in a clean vertical line. "You want that hot pipe as short as you can get it inside, straight up the stack. All that rock's just going to suck the heat right out." But Maddie understood something Jensen didn't. The hot exhaust gases rushing up a straight pipe carried most of their heat straight out the chimney, often still 300 degrees when they hit the outside air. By forcing those gases to travel 20 extra feet through dense stone, he could capture and store that wasted heat. The rocks would absorb the intense heat during his evening fire, then radiate it back into the cabin all night long. He'd rerouted his stovepipe that fall, threading it horizontally through the wire cage in a series of S-curves before the final rise to the roof. The first test firing had worked exactly as he'd hoped. The stones near the pipe heated to nearly 200 degrees, storing enough energy to keep his cabin comfortable for 10 to 12 hours after the fire died. By November, he was using a third less wood than the previous winter and sleeping through the night without tending the stove. Now, after the worst blizzard in 20 years, Peterson stood in a warm cabin while his own family shivered in beds they'd barely left all night. The fool's pile of rocks had stored enough heat from one evening's fire to outlast the storm that had nearly killed half the valley. The autumn before the great blizzard, Maddie had started his experiments in earnest. September nights were dropping into the 30s, perfect conditions for testing his rock cage against conventional heating without risking his life if something went wrong. He approached the work like the careful craftsman he was, measuring temperatures with a cheap mercury thermometer ordered from a Duluth catalog, and timing his fires with the precision of a man who'd spent years in lumber camps, where wasted effort meant shorter pay. His first controlled test came on a clear October night when the outdoor temperature held steady at 10 degrees. Using his old straight pipe setup one final time, Maddie fed his iron stove from 7 until 10 in the evening, burning roughly 35 pounds of split birch, a typical load for a cold night. The cabin air near the ceiling climbed to 75 degrees, dropping to about 60 at bed level, where he actually slept. By 5 in the morning, with the fire long dead and coals turned to ash, the cabin had fallen to 38 degrees. Matty woke with frost on his water bucket and his breath fogging in the pale dawn light streaming through his single window. 3 days later, with similar weather conditions, he fired up the rock cage system for the first time. The same 35 pounds of birch, the same 3-hour burn, but now his stovepipe snaked through 20 feet of dense stone before rising to the chimney. The difference was immediately apparent. The stovepipe surface near the stove climbed to nearly 600 degrees, hot enough to blue the metal, while the stones around the middle sections of pipe reached an estimated 180 degrees by the time he banked the coals at 10 o'clock. The cabin air topped out at 70 degrees, slightly cooler than the straight pipe test, but something more important was happening at floor level. When Matty woke at 5 the next morning, his thermometer read 52 degrees. The rock cage surface was still warm to the touch, maybe 90 to 100 degrees, radiating steady heat into the cabin's living space. Instead of a 30-degree temperature drop overnight, he'd experienced only an 18-degree swing, and the warmth was distributed evenly from floor to ceiling rather than pooled uselessly near the roof beams. The physics were straightforward enough that any blacksmith or mason would have understood them immediately, though most frontier settlers had never thought to apply the principle to home heating. Hot exhaust gases from a wood fire normally rushed up the chimney pipe at 350 degrees or higher, carrying enormous amounts of energy straight into the outside air. Matty's extended flue path forced those gases to surrender their heat to dense stone before they could escape. The stones, with their massive thermal capacity, absorbed the energy during the intense evening burn and released it slowly over the following 12 hours. More importantly, the rock mass sat at floor level where people actually lived, not up near the ceiling where conventional cast iron stoves concentrated their heat. Radiant energy from warm stone traveled in all directions, heating furniture, walls, and sleeping bodies directly rather than just superheating the air near the roof. The difference between radiant and convective heating was the difference between standing in sunshine and standing in a hot wind. One warmed you evenly and comfortably, the other gave you a scorched face and cold feet. By November, Matty was documenting wood savings that exceeded his most optimistic estimates. Where he'd burned nearly 2 full cords during the previous autumn, the rock cage system was using barely 1 1/4 cords for the same period. The 30 to 40% reduction in fuel consumption meant he could heat his cabin through an entire winter with wood from his own small lot, without the dangerous and exhausting work of cutting additional timber in deep snow or hauling fuel from distant forests. Word of the strange system began to spread through the scattered community of homesteaders, though not in ways that brought Matty any credit. John Peterson mentioned the contraption to his wife, who shared the story with Anna Corpella during a quilting session. Anna told her neighbor, who passed it along to Carl Jensen at the general store. By late November, the tale had grown in the telling. Some claimed Matty had built a forge in his cabin. Others insisted he was storing gunpowder or running some kind of illegal still. The few who understood the actual purpose dismissed it as the desperate improvisation of a man too poor to buy proper heating equipment. Jensen visited again in early December, bringing along Anders Lund, a young settler who'd been asking questions about more efficient heating methods. The two men examined the rock cage with the suspicious attention of livestock buyers checking a potentially diseased animal. The stovepipe entered the wire mesh at one corner, curved back toward the center, looped forward again, then made a final bend before rising vertically to the roof. Each section was supported by scrap iron brackets and surrounded by carefully selected stones, nothing larger than a man's head, nothing smaller than his fist, all chosen for their ability to absorb and hold heat without cracking under thermal stress. "Looks like a blacksmith shop," Jensen pronounced. "You built a sauna in your living room and forgot the bath." Anders was more thoughtful, running his hands along the wire mesh and noting how the stones were arranged to allow air circulation while maximizing contact with the hot metal pipe. "How do you clean the creosote?" he asked, the first technical question anyone had posed about the system. Matty showed him the removable sections of pipe and the small access doors he'd built into the wire cage. "Clean it same as any stovepipe, just more of it. but I burn hot fires, dry wood. Not much creosote when you do it right. Despite the demonstrated fuel savings and improved comfort, most visitors left convinced that Matty had created an overcomplicated solution to a simple problem. Americans heated with iron stoves and straight pipes because the method was proven, reliable, and recommended by every stove manufacturer in the country. The Finnish bachelor's jury-rigged contraption might work for him, but it was hardly a model that sensible people would want to copy. Even Anna Corpella, who heated her own cabin with a struggling cook stove and constantly worried about her dwindling woodpile, shook her head at the sight of the rock cage. "Takes up half your floor," she observed. "Where would I put my children's beds?" The criticism didn't bother Matty. He'd grown up among people who measured heating systems by their effectiveness over entire winters, not their appearance in October. His grandfather had always said that the ugliest stove in the village was usually the one that kept its owners warmest when the real cold arrived. As December deepened and his neighbors began their nightly battles with inadequate heating systems, Matty continued his methodical testing, documenting temperatures and fuel consumption with the patience of a man who knew that winter would provide the ultimate validation of his work. The winter of 1887 to 1888 had already earned a reputation for severity before January brought its worst punch. December had delivered heavy snows and persistent cold that strained heating systems across the upper Midwest, with recorded temperatures in northern Minnesota falling to 15 below zero on multiple nights. Homesteaders who'd grown comfortable with their standard heating routines found themselves burning wood faster than they'd planned, making extra trips to distant timber lots, and waking multiple times each night to feed hungry iron stoves. On the morning of January 12, 1888, the weather seemed to offer a brief reprieve. Temperatures climbed into the 20s and low 30s across the region, warm enough for men to work outside without heavy coats, and for children to play in the snow without immediate risk of frostbite. The mild conditions felt like a gift after weeks of brutal cold, and many settlers used the opportunity to haul firewood, repair storm damage, or simply enjoy a few hours outdoors without the constant threat of freezing. But Matty had learned to read weather signs during his years in lumber camps, where a mist storm could trap entire crews for days or kill men caught away from shelter. The wind had shifted during the night, coming now from the northwest instead of the southwest, and the quality of light had that peculiar clarity that often preceded the worst blizzards. By noon, thin clouds were streaming in high overhead, and the barometric pressure, which Matty could feel in his joints and sinuses, was dropping fast. He spent the afternoon preparing his cabin for what he suspected would be a significant storm. Unlike his neighbors, who would wait until evening to start their fires, Matty began charging his rock mass at 3 o'clock, building the kind of intense, concentrated fire that his system was designed to handle. He opened all the air vents on his iron stove wide, fed it with the driest birch from his woodshed, and maintained temperatures that would have been dangerous in a conventional heating setup. The stovepipe near the firebox climbed to over 600 degrees, while the stones around the middle sections of flue reached nearly 200 degrees, hot enough that he couldn't hold his hand within 6 inches of the wire mesh. By 7 in the evening, as the first snow began to fall and the wind picked up, Matty had pumped roughly 50 to 60 pounds of wood through his stove in a single sustained burn. The rock cage had absorbed an enormous amount of thermal energy, enough to keep his small cabin comfortable for 12 to 15 hours, even if the outside temperature dropped to dangerous levels. He banked the coals, closed the air vents, and settled in with an extra wool blanket, expecting not to tend the fire again until morning. The storm hit with the sudden violence that would make it legendary across the Great Plains and upper Midwest. Within 2 hours, temperatures plunged from the low 30s to near zero, driven by winds that reached 60 miles per hour and carried snow with the cutting force of sand. The blizzard would later be called the Children's Blizzard, because it caught so many school children away from home, but it killed adults just as efficiently. Farmers caught between their houses and barns, travelers trapped on roads, and families whose heating systems simply couldn't keep pace with the rapid temperature drop. In conventional cabins across the valley, the storm created immediate crises. John Peterson found himself making dangerous trips to his woodshed every 2 hours, fighting through whiteout conditions to haul armloads of split wood back to his struggling stove. Each time he opened the cabin door, precious heated air rushed out into the night, replaced by Arctic wind that drove the indoor temperature down several degrees in minutes. His wife kept the children huddled under quilts near the iron stove, but even there the temperature at floor level dropped into the 40s by midnight. The Peterson family burned through nearly 100 pounds of wood during the night, more than they typically used in 3 days of normal winter weather. Despite the constant feeding, their cabin never achieved the stable warmth that would have allowed comfortable sleep. The iron stove created fierce heat in a small radius around the firebox, but the warmth couldn't spread effectively through the single-wall log construction against the pressure of wind-driven cold. By 3 in the morning, with John exhausted from repeated trips outside and the family's wood supply running dangerously low, they were facing the real possibility of freezing in their own home. Anna Corpella, alone with her 2 young children, faced an even more desperate situation, her smaller cabin and lighter. Construction meant that heat loss happened faster, and she lacked the physical strength to haul the massive amounts of wood that the storm demanded. She burned every piece of split fuel in her shed during the first 6 hours of the blizzard, then began breaking up furniture. First a spare chair, then part of a wooden crate to keep her cook stove alive. By dawn, she was burning green wood cut from fence posts, creating so much smoke that she had to crack a window despite the deadly cold outside. Meanwhile, in his cabin with the mocked rock cage, Matty slept soundly through the worst of the storm. The thermal mass he'd charged during the afternoon released its stored energy steadily throughout the night, maintaining indoor temperatures that his neighbors would have considered luxurious. At midnight, when the storm was at its peak and outdoor temperatures had fallen to 22 below zero, his cabin maintained 58 degrees at bed level. The rock cage surface temperature had dropped to about 120 degrees, still warm to the touch, but no longer dangerously hot. The physics of his system worked exactly as designed under extreme conditions. While his neighbors' straight pipe stoves dumped most of their heat energy directly up the chimney and out into the storm, Matty's extended flue had captured and stored that energy in 4 tons of dense stone. The rocks released their heat through radiation rather than convection, warming surfaces and objects throughout the cabin rather than just heating air that would immediately rise to the ceiling and leak out through gaps in the construction. More importantly, the system's thermal inertia meant that brief temperature drops caused by opening doors or sudden wind gusts didn't immediately affect interior comfort. The massive rock pile continued radiating steady heat regardless of short-term fluctuations, creating the kind of stable indoor environment that allowed deep restorative sleep even during a life-threatening storm. As dawn approached on January 13th and the worst of the blizzard began to move east, Matty woke naturally rather than from cold. His cabin thermometer read 50 degrees, and the rock cage was still radiating gentle warmth. Outside, the mercury had bottomed out somewhere below 25 degrees below zero, with drifts piled against his door and ice coating every exposed surface. But inside his derided, overcomplicated heating system had maintained comfortable conditions for over 12 hours without any attention, using no more fuel than he typically burned during ordinary cold weather. The storm that nearly killed families throughout the region had been nothing more than a good night's sleep in the cabin with the rock pile that everyone called a fool's errand. News of what had happened during the children's blizzard spread through the scattered homestead community with the efficiency of wildfire. Men who ventured out to check on neighbors found a pattern that defied everything they thought they knew about frontier heating. The Peterson family had survived, but barely, huddled together under every blanket they owned while John fed their iron stove with furniture legs and fence pickets when the split wood ran out. Anna Corpella had kept her children alive by burning a wooden bucket and part of her kitchen table, creating so much smoke from green wood that ice had formed on the inside of her windows from the moisture. Similar stories emerged from cabins throughout the valley. The Andersons had taken turns staying awake all night to feed their stove, burning through 6 days' worth of wood in 12 hours. The Miller family had moved their mattresses into the kitchen and slept on the floor around their cook stove, the only way to stay warm enough to survive. Every household had its tale of desperate improvisation, near freezing temperatures, and wood supplies pushed to the breaking point. Then visitors started making their way to Matty's place. Word had gotten out that the Finnish hermit with the strange rock pile had somehow weathered the storm without crisis, and men wanted to see for themselves what had actually happened in that cabin everyone had dismissed as the product of foreign foolishness. John Peterson arrived first, still exhausted from his night of constant fire tending, and convinced he would find Maddie either dead or barely alive. Instead, he discovered a man who had slept peacefully through the worst blizzard in memory, waking to a 50-degree cabin and coffee that was still warm from heat radiating off the rock cage. Peterson spent an hour walking around the contraption, holding his hands near the stones and trying to understand how 4 tons of river rock could outperform every conventional heating system in the valley. The evidence was undeniable. Peterson's own cabin, with its straight pipe iron stove and standard construction, had required constant attention and massive fuel consumption just to maintain temperatures that hovered near freezing. Maddie's system had provided steady, comfortable heat for over 12 hours with no tending whatsoever, using no more wood than a typical cold evening. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the difference between survival and comfort, between a night of desperate struggle and a full night's sleep. Carl Jensen arrived the next day, bringing Anders Lund and 2 other men who wanted to examine the rock cage system. Jensen still maintained that proper heating required a straight, hot chimney pipe, but he couldn't explain why his recommended approach had failed so dramatically while Maddie's wasteful design had succeeded. The men spent the morning measuring the rock pile, noting the pipe routing, and discussing the mechanics of heat storage with the grudging attention of farmers examining a neighbor's superior crop yield. Anders was particularly interested in the thermal performance. He had documented his own cabin's temperature, swings during the storm from 75 degrees near his iron stove down to 35 degrees by morning, a 40-degree range that made comfortable sleep impossible. Maddie's cabin had experienced perhaps a 15-degree swing, and all of it within a comfortable range. The rock mass didn't just store more heat, it released that heat at floor level where people actually lived, rather than letting it pool uselessly near the ceiling. The technical advantages became clearer as more neighbors visited and compared their experiences. Conventional iron stoves created intense heat in a small radius around the firebox, but that heat rose immediately to the ceiling and leaked out through gaps in log construction. The radiant energy from Maddie's rock cage traveled in all directions, warming furniture, walls, and sleeping surfaces directly. People reported feeling comfortable at distances from the rock pile, where they would have been cold near a conventional stove. More importantly, the thermal mass provided stability that iron heating simply couldn't match. When doors opened during the storm, conventional cabins lost precious heated air that took significant time and fuel to replace. Maddie's rock cage continued radiating steady heat regardless of brief temperature fluctuations, maintaining comfortable conditions even when outside air entered the cabin. The difference between heating air and heating mass was the difference between trying to warm a room with a hairdryer and warming it with sunshine. Within a week, Anna Korpela asked Maddie to help her build a smaller version of his system. Her cabin couldn't support 4 tons of stone, and she lacked the space for a full cage, but she wondered if a smaller thermal mass might still provide some of the stability that had kept Maddie comfortable during the storm. Together they designed a 2-ton stone bench that surrounded her cook stove, with the stovepipe making 2 loops through carefully arranged rocks before rising to the roof. The construction took 3 days of hauling stones from the creek and building a reinforced section of floor to support the additional weight. Anna's neighbors watched the work with the same skepticism they had shown Maddie's original project, but the widow was desperate enough to try anything that might reduce her wood consumption and improve her children's safety during cold snaps. The first test came during a mild January cold spell, with outdoor temperatures dropping to 5 below zero. Anna's modified system performed exactly as Maddie had predicted. Her evening cooking fire heated the stone bench to comfortable warmth, and the rocks continued radiating heat through the night. Instead of waking to a freezing kitchen and the dangerous work of rekindling a cold stove, she found her cabin still warm enough for the children to dress without shivering. By February, Anna was documenting fuel savings that matched Maddie's experience. Her modified system used roughly 60% of the wood required by her previous straight pipe setup, and the improved temperature stability meant better sleep and less risk during the coldest weather. Word of her success spread quickly through the community of homesteaders, and within weeks several other families were asking for help building their own versions of the thermal mass heater. Anders Lund constructed the most ambitious adaptation, building a stone wall along one side of his cabin with his stovepipe, making 4 horizontal runs through the masonry before turning vertical. His system stored nearly 3 tons of thermal mass and provided heat distribution throughout a larger living space than either Maddie's or Anna's cabins. The results were so impressive that Anders began documenting temperatures and fuel consumption with the methodical attention of a man planning to share his findings with other settlers. The transformation in community opinion was swift and complete. Men who had mocked Maddie's rock cage as foreign foolishness now visited regularly to examine construction details and discuss thermal principles they had never considered before the storm. The children's blizzard had provided an undeniable test of heating systems under extreme conditions, and the results showed that the immigrant bachelor's wasteful design was actually the most efficient and reliable method anyone in the valley had ever seen. By spring of 1888, the transformation in Maddie's standing among his neighbors was complete. Men who had openly laughed at his rock pile now approached him with the respectful attention they might show a successful farmer whose methods had produced exceptional crops. The evidence from the brutal winter was too clear to dismiss. While conventional heating systems had barely kept families alive, Maddie's thermal mass design had provided comfort and safety with remarkable fuel efficiency. As the snow melted and settlers took inventory of their winter wood consumption, the numbers told a story that even the most skeptical couldn't ignore. John Peterson had burned through nearly 8 cords of split wood during the coldest months, leaving him with barely enough fuel to last through the occasional spring cold snaps. His family had endured dozens of nights when someone had to wake every few hours to feed their iron stove, and they had come dangerously close to running out of fuel entirely during the worst weather. Maddie, heating a similar-sized space with his rock cage system, still had over 3 cords of wood remaining in his shed, enough to carry him through a cool spring and provide a solid start for the following winter. His fuel savings of 30 to 40% had been achieved while maintaining consistently warmer and more stable indoor temperatures. The contrast wasn't just about economics, though the reduced wood consumption represented weeks of dangerous winter cutting and hauling that Maddie had avoided entirely. Anders Lund became the most dedicated student of thermal mass heating, documenting his own system's performance with the methodical attention of a man who understood he had witnessed something significant. His stone wall installation had reduced his family's wood consumption from 7 cords to approximately 4.5 during the coldest part of winter. More importantly, the improved temperature stability had transformed their daily routine. No more middle-of-the-night trips to the woodshed, no more mornings when the children had to dress in a freezing kitchen, no more constant worry about maintaining enough fire to survive unexpected cold snaps. Word of the thermal mass system spread beyond the immediate valley through the networks of kinship and commerce that connected frontier communities. Traveling merchants carried stories of the Finnish bachelor's rock cage to settlements throughout northern Minnesota and across the border into Wisconsin and the Dakotas. Letters written to relatives in established towns described the remarkable heating method that had outperformed conventional stoves during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. The response was skeptical at first, as it always was when frontier innovations challenged established practices. But as more settlers experimented with thermal mass principles, the results consistently validated what Maddie had discovered through his combination of old-world knowledge and practical necessity. Stone benches, rock-filled wire cages, and masonry walls that incorporated extended flue runs began appearing in cabins throughout the upper Midwest, each adaptation suited to local materials and specific heating needs. Carl Jensen, the storekeeper who had initially dismissed the rock cage as wasteful foolishness, found himself in the awkward position of trying to explain why his recommended straight pipe installations had performed so poorly during the blizzard. His customers were asking increasingly informed questions about thermal mass, radiant heating, and fuel efficiency, concepts that hadn't been part of frontier heating discussions before Maddie's demonstration of their practical importance. Jensen eventually began stocking heavier gauge stovepipe and offering advice about extended flue runs, though he never fully embraced the thermal mass approach. His business model depended on selling iron stoves and the frequent replacement of thin stovepipes, not on helping customers build heating systems that would last for decades while using minimal fuel. The conflict between commercial interests and practical effectiveness would persist throughout the frontier period, with many settlers caught between what storekeepers recommended and what actually worked in their cabins. Matty himself remained characteristically modest about his role in what was quietly becoming a small revolution in frontier heating practices. When neighbors asked for guidance, he shared his knowledge freely, emphasizing the principles rather than specific construction details. The key insight wasn't the particular arrangement of stones and wire that he had built, but the understanding that heat could be stored in dense mass and released slowly over many hours. Different cabins required different approaches, but the fundamental physics remained constant. He taught his visitors to select stones carefully, choosing dense granite and basalt that could absorb and hold heat without cracking under thermal stress. He showed them how to calculate safe clearances between hot stovepipe and combustible materials, using scrap metal shields and sand barriers where necessary. Most importantly, he demonstrated the firing technique that made thermal mass systems work efficiently: short, intense burns that heated the stones to maximum capacity, followed by long periods when the stored heat provided comfortable warmth without any attention to the fire. The safety aspects of thermal mass heating required careful explanation, since the extended flue runs and higher thermal loads created risks that didn't exist with conventional straight pipe installations. Matty emphasized the importance of proper chimney draft, adequate structural support for heavy stone masses, and regular cleaning of the longer flue paths that could accumulate creosote if not maintained properly. His own system included removable pipe sections and access doors that made inspection and cleaning straightforward, features that he insisted on including in every installation he helped design. By autumn of 1888, 5 families in the immediate valley had built thermal mass heating systems based on Matty's principles. Each installation was different: Anna's stone bench, Anders' wall-mounted system, a new settler's rock-filled fireplace surround, but all shared the common elements of extended flue runs through dense thermal mass. The approaching winter would provide another test of these systems, though none as severe as the children's blizzard that had first demonstrated their superiority. The broader impact of Matty's innovation extended beyond the immediate practical benefits of improved heating efficiency. His success had challenged the assumption that frontier life required constant struggle against the elements, showing instead that traditional knowledge adapted to local conditions could provide comfort and safety with less effort than conventional methods demanded. The rock cage system represented something larger than a heating innovation. It was proof that thoughtful preparation and understanding of natural principles could triumph over accepted wisdom and commercial recommendations. As winter approached again, Matty prepared his cabin with the quiet confidence of a man whose methods had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. His rock cage stood ready to capture and store the thermal energy that would keep him comfortable through another season of cold weather, using principles that connected him to generations of northern craftsmen who had learned to work with winter rather than simply endure it.